covered anatomy, the next thing that we have to cover is the foundational information based on classifying speech sounds. So speech sounds, or phonemes, are consonants and vowels that we put together to create words. So phonemes are really just those isolated sounds that we make. So if we're looking just at this slide right here, for our phonemes of classifying, we have the k, ul, a, s, I, f, I, e, g. Okay, so those are the phonemes. It's not the graphemes, which is what you're reading right now. It's not these sounds. So the C is not a phoneme or a speech sound. The speech sound is actually the k that we make at the beginning of this word. So let's go into how we classify those consonants and our vowels. Consonants are classified according to the constriction in the oral cavity, according to the place, manner, and voicing. So when we talk about place, we're talking about the location of that constriction, whether it's at the tongue touching the alveolar ridge, or it's the back of the tongue touching the velum, or if it's the lips coming together, or the tongue coming through the teeth. There's lots of different options that we'll talk about later. The manner relates to the degree or type of constriction. So how are we forcing that sound or that air through the oral cavity or through the nasal cavity? So for instance, in this image, we have this ongoing flow of air, which is going to give us our tss sound, kind of an S sound. If we use the same placement with our tongue touching the alveolar ridge and just do an explosion of air, we can do a T sound, so a T sound versus an S sound. We also have voicing, which is the presence or absence of vocal fold vibrations. So we have that sound created at the level of the vocal cords, but we don't necessarily have to have vibrations of the vocal cords to create our speech sounds. For instance, if I say K, as in cat, I have no vibration of the vocal folds during K. But if I say G, as in gift, I do have vibrations of the vocal folds during the production of that G at the beginning of gift. So for the place or location of constriction, we have several different types of categorizations. We have bilabials, which are the two lips coming together for sounds like P, B, M, and W. So this would be P, B, M, and W. Then we have our labiodentals, which is the lips and the teeth. So labial is lips, right? We can see labial here and labial here. And then dental is our teeth, so it's the lips and the teeth coming together for F and V, or F and V. Then we have the dental, which is the teeth and the tongue coming together. So if you're in the phonetics class, they might also refer to this as lingua dental, and that's just meaning that the tongue and the teeth are coming together. And those are for our voiced and voiceless TH. So our th, as in bath, or th, as in bathe. And then we have alveolar, where the tongue touches the alveolar ridge. Again, it may be classified as lingua alveolar. And that is for sounds like t, d, s, z, n, and ul. And then we have our palatal, where the tongue touches the palate, for our sh, zh, ch, j. We have velar, where the tongue touches the soft palate or the velum. And those are the ones in the back of the mouth, so our ng, our k, and our g. So when we're talking about back versus front sounds, our velar sounds are our back sounds. Our front sounds are our alveolar, dental, labial, dental, and bilabial sounds. And then finally we have our glottal, which is just the air going through the vocal cords, and that's our h sound. It can also be a glottal stop if we say something like oh, oh, and we just have that explosion of air on that Next up we have our manner, which is our degree or type of constriction. So we have our stops, which are also classified as plosives, and that's like a small explosion of air in the mouth. So these are going to be our sounds like p, b, t, d, k, and G. Then we have fricatives, which is our hissing sounds. So we have S, Z, Sh, Zh, and H. That essentially means that we have that constriction as the tongue is closing off the area in the mouth, and we also have some airflow through the teeth. Next up we have affricates, and that's a combination of a stop and a fricative. If you're in the phonetics class, it's really easy to remember because it's always going to have two phonemes listed. So for ch, we have the T and the sh created together for our t-ch sound. We also have the zh sound. Next up we have glides, which is the gradual change in the shape of our articulators for our w and y. Next up is liquids, and these are more like vowels, so our tongue position is what's going to direct the airflow, and that's the and ol sound. And finally we have nasals, and you're familiar with nasals because these are the ones we talked about in the resonance section, and that's our n, and ng sounds. So as you're looking at these, I want you to play around with these different sounds before you move forward so you can feel the different constriction in the mouth. Finally, we have voicing, and voicing is just the presence or absence of vocal fold vibrations. The best way to tell if a sound is voiced or unvoiced is to place your hand on your throat very gently and feel if there is a vibration, and these are all in pairs. So for our B, we have a pair of a voiceless sound, P. The trick to learning the difference between a voiced and a voiceless sound, I'll also say, is to make sure that you leave the vowel off. So you don't want to say B, P, because that's going to confuse you. You want just the isolated sound, B, P, D, T, G, K, V, F, D, T, J, Sh, Z, S, Y, J, Ch, N, Ng. So hopefully you can hear the difference between our voiced and our voiceless. For vowels, we're classifying according to the tongue position and the lips, and it is whether the tongue is in the front, the central, back, if it's high, mid, or low. So if you imagine a tongue here, we have the front of the tongue here, right, the apex, and then we have the back of the tongue here, and this is our body. So we're determining if the tongue is high in front, such as with E, or if it's back, such as or if it's low, such as ah. Vowels are always voiced. You're not going to have a voiceless vowel, but it may change according to if the lips are rounded or not. So, for instance, with E, we have a fairly flat line in the lips, so these are not rounded. And then we have oo, which is a rounded vowel. We also can combine vowels together, which gives us a continuous change in the vocal tract. That just means that the tongue moves from one position to another. For instance, with cow, we have ow for the combination of that ow at the end of cow. We also have the combination of o, oi, boy, and that's just that movement from this position in the back to a position in the front. Now we do have a problem with the alphabet because there is many languages and each letters of the alphabet stands for a sound. So you may notice as we're going through this lecture, you're like, I'm looking at these letters that I've looked at my entire life. I don't understand where you're getting these sounds from. And a lot of that can go back to the fact that I don't make you learn phonetics in this class. So I try to use the phonetics that are part of the English alphabet and part of the International Phonetic Alphabet, which we'll learn about in just a moment. But it's essentially just a classification of sounds so that we can better determine how the speech sounds are actually produced versus how we spell a word, because the representation of the way that we spell a word does not reflect the way that we produce it. And that really is reflected in sound words like cell versus cap. When we look at these letters, we have a C at the beginning and a C at the beginning here, but we say them very differently. So these are going to get two different phonemes, and we have to be able to classify that. We also have differences in account versus luck. We have the same sound, but different letters. The same for khaki versus echo. We have the same sound, but different letters, and these are again different from our luck and our account. And then we can have multiple letters that give us a single sound. So for phone versus finger, the same sound, even though we're using different numbers of letters. Another problem is for really the letter Q. We don't say queen, Q-een. We say k-ween, which is two different phonemes or two different speech sounds for one letter. So how do we adequately represent these sounds? And that's by using the International Phonetic Alphabet. You'll learn this if you're going to take the phonetics class in the future. I don't make you learn it for this class. But do know that some of these sounds might show up on the test because they're fairly representative of the sounds that you're familiar with. For instance, our B, our D, our F, our G, our H, our K, our M, our N are all sounds that you're already familiar with. So, for instance, this is a phonetic representation of the sound B. This is the phonetic representation of the sound D. So it just gives us a set of symbols that represent most of the sounds in all languages so that we can transcribe them across languages. And this was really important when we're doing our speech evaluations to determine if a child is saying a speech sound correctly. There is a summary of this chart in your textbook on page 129. I also recommend that you complete the phonetic chart that I've provided on the module. This is just meant to give you a study guide for this so you can see the differences between the speech sounds and complete that as you're going through this or you're going through the textbook.